and thank you for finding your way to another wonderful session here in the American Indian Studies program. This is our speaker series, and we're very privileged this morning to have with us Kyle Whyte. But before I introduce him, I just want to again acknowledge our place here in the traditional territories of the Cayuga people. And I want to offer my thanks to Ula for all of her help in helping me organize this from week to week. And this began, of course, last April. So it's just a real pleasure to work with Ula and Natani as well. If you notice the banner for this particular session, I would have to say it's one of my all-time favorites, and I really just want to acknowledge her skills and vision for that work. It's just such beautiful imagery that she puts together to help announce these sessions. Likewise, I just want to thank the Associate Director and our current Director for their continued assistance and just the financing and making sure everything is available for us to bring this together on a week-to-week basis. So, Kyle Whyte. Kyle Whyte is an enrolled member of the Citizen Haudenosaunee, Oklahoma. He is a leading scholar in the area of philosophy and the intersection of philosophy and climate change, climate issues around justice. He holds the Timnick Chair in the Humanities in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. Of course, he's published in a whole range of journal venues that I will only highlight a few here. American Journal of Bioethics, Ecological Processes, Human Ecology, Journal of Global Ethics, and on. I would also just highlight that he is on the U.S. Department of Interior's Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science, which just has a significant role to play in the directing the research of the climate centers in the United States, and has recently returned from a set of wonderful exchanges from here to Aotearoa, Hawaii, and other places. So it's just a real pleasure and privilege to have him here with us today. So please help me welcome Kyle to AIS.
It's nice to meet everybody and hope to get a chance to talk with you more. I agree, those posters are like the best things ever. Yeah, I was like, man, this is, yeah, I've never quite seen myself presented that nicely. Usually it's like a Word document with, if I'm lucky, my name's in bold. But I just want to offer you guys a gift to the American Indian program, birch basket from where I live, and then there's some Indian bling inside. And also I wanted to
Thank you very much.
and give you guys for your storage of this bag from the Haudenosaunee Sustainability Institute, which I do a lot of work with, to be able to use as needed. But I appreciate the chance to be here and connect with other Native folks and folks interested in Native things. So I wanted to start off the presentation, give you a little bit more detail about the kind of work that I do. And then I wanted to go into some key ideas that I think are part of this huge discussion about climate justice and Indigenous people. You know, if any of you all read the media, you've definitely seen something about Indigenous people and climate justice. So I'm going to give you some of the ideas that I've developed about that topic. So to begin with, a little bit about me. So I'm Haudenosaunee, and you know, originally and before this time, this was kind of our range, and we're part of the Three Fires group, so Anishinaabe, that includes Odawa and Ojibwe people. And historically, the way we did things is we had a seasonal lifestyle. It was based on harvesting all sorts of different things, and the cool part about this lifestyle is we had a flexible political structure that shifted and changed depending on the season, the time of year, in order to be able to harvest the resources that we needed to survive. And all that was pretty good, and then this happened, the Trail of Death. And we found ourselves very quickly in the 19th century in Oklahoma. And pretty big change in climate region, a very quick period of time. And literally right here in the middle with a bunch of other tribes from the Great Lakes, kind of between some of the western tribes and some of the eastern tribes. And as you know, Oklahoma, no offense, but it's not the prettiest of places. It's definitely, you know, we have this migration story in our history that says we migrated to the Great Lakes when we reached a place where food grows on water, so wild rice. I always tell people, you know, Oklahoma is definitely not the land where food grows on water. I know they have wild rice in Texas, but you know, Oklahoma Indians learned very quickly not to go to Texas. But we rebuilt our nation, and it's been an amazing story of living in new land. We've kept many of our traditions, way of life. But really, for me, I wanted to be in the Great Lakes area because all of the plants and animals that we heard about, you know, in Oklahoma and some of the other places I live where I grew up too, you know, all those things exist in the Great Lakes, and I really wanted to try to spend at least some part of my career working in a region where there's just a number of plants and animals and activities, ways of life that you can really only take part in that particular region. And so, any of you ricers, how's my technique? Not bad.
Mediocre.
Oh, that's right. Oh, that's right. There's someone from White Earth here. I'm very critical. Why is your elbow so higher? Why do you got gloves on, partner? Yeah, I know. So in my job at Michigan State, you know, I really wanted to be with a group of scholars that also very much cared about the Great Lakes region. So I formed a group of scholars that work on environmental ethics, environmental stewardship, and we're now the biggest program of its kind. We have a lot of get-togethers, we support each other's scholarship, we confirm every stereotype about how philosophers do research. I always joke with people, I'm like, you know, because I'm the only Indian in the program, and it's like, are you a token if you're the one that started it? If you're the only Indian, does that make you a token? Always sort of wondered. I also work with a number of other groups that share the Great Lakes region with us and worked on environmental justice for some time. We hold big events trying to connect all sorts of people of color. So well, there's a white guy back there, but never mind. And you know, we have a lot of fun trying to figure out how people of all heritages can share the region. But really the passion I have is working with tribal college students. Even though I'm a professor, I got like terrible mentorship, like when I was a student, as in there were no mentors available to me. So I've really taken a lot of time to work with tribal college students and try to, you know, provide the mentorship that I have and have a good time together. Actually, she's the pony. You see what happens when you guys, you know, kind of go crazy? Yeah. And so here you go, Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group. Well, one thing that I love working about tribal college students is they're like taking leadership on all the issues that I care about. So this is a tribal college organized group. Is this one of the events you helped to organize? Is it that one?
No.
Actually, that's a little bit too late for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Indigenous People Climate Change Working Group, it's a tribal college student-driven organization, and they take leadership on a number of climate change issues that affect Indigenous people. Now, in terms of the research, I kind of divide my work into two areas. So the first area I call knowledge sovereignty and Indigenous planning. And so what we really work to do in all the projects I have under this part of research is how is it that in relation to climate change that tribes can really use their own knowledge but also use scientific resources to protect our culture, our way of life, our health, and so on. So I'm part of a group called the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group, and we put out this guidelines for considering traditional knowledge and climate change initiatives. We make stuff like brochures, primarily for scientists, about how to work with tribes. I'm part of the federal committee that Troy was telling you about. We advise the Interior Climate Science Centers and some other groups within the Department of Interior, and we produce reports like this for scientists, and like this report here includes a lot of tribal issues, so I sort of, it's my role with the other three people that I was telling you about to ensure that tribal issues are taken up in these federal discussions. Another one close to home for you. So this is the FIRST network. It stands for Facilitating Indigenous Research, Science, and Technology, and we're a group of Native folks from North America, and we're trying to figure out what other people, Native people, other parts of the world do to use research on, to support Indigenous people and for Indigenous people to succeed in developing their own research. And so this group is a lot of fun. Another group is Rising Voices of Indigenous People in Weather and Atmospheric Science. These are the rising voices. We seek to increase the influence of Native people in climate science. Most of my projects I do as collaborations between my university and the Sustainable Development Institute at Menominee, so that's where the bag comes from. And they've got their own model of sustainability that they developed to figure out how they had survived colonialism and succeeded in maintaining the capacity of their community. And we do a lot of dialogues to connect scientists and Indigenous people. If you've ever been to Menominee, it's awesome. It's one of the prettiest parts of the Great Lakes. We have events like this, have some music, some fun, and I organize dialogues. This is one of the dialogues I organize, connecting scientists and Native people. I call them dialogues, but I just boss people around. Then I get tired bossing people around and I fall asleep. We put together research teams that work specifically with tribes to support climate change adaptation. And so this is one of the research teams we put together with myself, folks from Menominee, tribal college students. Another research team we put together, another one. I also write on these issues. So this is one of my articles on traditional knowledge, knowledge sovereignty, tribal planning. It's another one, some of your friends. The other aspect of my work I call climate policy, and this has a lot more to do with the stuff I'm going to talk about today. And this is from a meeting, the First Stewards Symposium. It meets a couple of years in Washington to try to educate legislators and policymakers about issues that tribes within the U.S. sphere face with respect to climate change. Cool meeting with people from all over the U.S. sphere, the Pacific. We also do a lot of Indigenous exchanges to try to learn how Indigenous people from different parts of the world have dealt with policy issues. So this is an exchange we did between 3 different Indigenous river restoration projects. One the Maori did, one they did at Walpole Island, and one that the Ojibways at Grand Traverse did. And so we do a lot of cool stuff with that project as well, float on the river together. And we even made some of the Maoris. We took this river, the white people call it the Boardman River, but it should be called the Ottawa River. So all the Maori and Anishinaabe elders then nailed the new sign to the fence post. Yeah. And I've recently been trying to work at the United Nations level as well. So this is a group we met over the summer in Geneva. It's 33 different Indigenous representatives from all parts of the world, and we worked on conflict resolution together and peacemaking. And this stuff I think is really powerful because we have our history here of colonization and resurgence and so on, and they have their own histories, and it's like some of the stuff that happened here a long time ago, like they're experiencing right now. Like for example, the roommate I had who was like 24 years old, he himself was a boarding school survivor, or certainly for most of us it's more like our grandparents or our great-grandparents. And so it's been very powerful to connect with these folks, and many of you have been to the protests and other important things that Indigenous people have led on climate change. And I've done some writing on these topics as well, what I think about policy views, bless you, and some boring, stuff that's targeted for legislators and people that don't, like to hear the word justice and injustice and things like that. So as someone who's actually trained in philosophy, but who primarily works with non-philosophers, I've sort of understood my work in 2 ways. So one, I work on ethical issues that come up when we as tribes have to work with non-tribal groups. So what are the best forms of conduct for scientists and other non-tribal folks to work with us? But then also as a tribal member, and somebody who is repeatedly criticizing my own tribal government, and also other tribal governments, I'm interested in ethical issues that are internal to tribes that we face within our own, within our own publics, right, within our own context, that oftentimes a lot of Native folks don't know about or aren't educated on. So a lot of my work is really internal to tribes. And the reason why I initially got interested in climate change as a topic that's important to Indigenous people is, first I'm a member of a relocation tribe, so we experienced climate change very early. A friend of mine made a t-shirt for me that said, Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the original climate change survivors. And this is something that we actually have talked about for a long time, about how we had to adapt to the new climate region that we found ourselves in Oklahoma. But it's also the case that when I moved back to the Great Lakes region, all the plants and animals that I was interested in, I realized that tribes were losing access to those plants and animals because of all sorts of changes in the habitat, some of which are stemming from climate change, but also other forms of environmental change that have gone on in the region. And when I found that out, and as I began to travel and learn more about what other Native people were facing with respect to climate change, I found all of these issues that were too similar to things that I was familiar with in my own life with my own community. So in terms of what Indigenous people are going through with respect to climate change, it's everything from relocation. In Alaska, there's a huge number of villages that are scheduled to be relocated because of things like sea level rise. There's groups in the Great Lakes region that are losing access to foods that they've depended on for years and years and years because the habitat is no longer conducive for the production of those foods. And when you lose stuff like this, then you get into situations where the fabric of your society that was built around those plants and animals then also goes away at a pace that's really too rapid to adapt to. And if you look at a lot of specific examples, so here's the village of Kivalina. It's this little sliver here. So you can imagine if they have sea level rise, it's going to be pretty hard to occupy that little sliver of land. Or the Nisquallies that most of you guys know are well known for their salmon, their activism in salmon, and both the commercial and cultural significance of salmon to the community. They're watching this glacier recede, and the glacier recedes, it affects the stream temperature. If you ever had a fish tank, you know how sensitive fish are to temperature, right? If the power goes out one night and that little heater thing isn't working, you could end up with a whole bunch of dead fish.
Which glacier is that?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
It's easy to look up.
Okay.
Does someone know? What?
It's the Nisqually Glacier.
Nisqually Glacier. So then with respect to, in Michigan, the 1836 treaty area, which is primarily manages the fishery in the Great Lakes region, as the water shift in temperature, right, some of the fish from, some of the fish from different parts are moving out of the treaty area, and then tribes don't have the same kind of right and access to those fish that they used to. This is a climate change issue. The Oneida tribe of Wisconsin, they're actually an urban tribe, and they get upset that all the federal funding for climate change is centered around tribes that are in rural situations. But they're dealing with issues like managing infrastructure in a city and so on. And so they're also facing kind of a conundrum with respect to climate change as well, being that they're a tribe that doesn't fit some of the ways in which the U.S. government understands tribes to be. But then also we've seen that Native people have been active in trying to stop some of the drivers of climate change, like the burning of fossil fuels and other activities. So for example, a lot of my friends that are Navajo, they're very active in trying to make it so that the Navajo Nation is no longer dependent on burning coal and no longer dependent on a lot of industrial activities. In terms of the different shale basins and fossil fuel basins in North America, like the tar sands, Native people, whether it's activists or tribal governments in the Pacific Northwest, have tried to block the different shipments and have tried to make it so that really there's a much bigger discussion about why these forms of energy production are problematic. And then in Alaska as well, there's been a huge issue about the conflict between folks that are living subsistence lifestyles and just the massive incursion of industrial activities and petroleum development and so on. And so these are all things that are fairly major issues that Native people face. And for me, when I was really learning about these issues, not just thinking about my own community, but thinking with others, you hear people describe these changes in ways that suggest that this is not just about economic loss. This isn't just about loss of resources. But you see when people describe environmental change from a Native perspective, they say things, right? Like, without it, our way of life, what we pass on to our kids and grandkids would be diminished. They say stuff, that, it's not that Indigenous people haven't adapted and changed, right? For years and years, we've shifted what plants and animals we harvest, and things that are traditional now were not traditional a long time ago. But sometimes when things happen so doggone quickly, it becomes a problem, even if you're a very adaptive society. And people just describing in detail, what they really value. It's not the rights to the resource. Chad, this is somebody from your neck of the woods, right? It's not, when the treaty protected the rights to rice, it wasn't protecting, white rice or any old wild rice. It was protecting that exact rice and the lifestyle that goes along with it, and the political structures and social structures that go along with it, right? All the value that rice holds. And so based on these kind of ideas, for me, what I was really thinking is that climate change vulnerability is not just about loss of economic resources or even things you would call resource, but it strikes to the heart of the fabric of our community. And I call this our collective continuance, so that climate change is an issue of our collective continuance. That is our capacity to be adaptive in ways that are sufficient for the livelihoods of our members to flourish in the future. And for me, what climate change really makes more difficult are three different aspects of this collective continuance, right? What we need to maintain ourselves as healthy communities given the kinds of struggles that we face, which are struggles that many other communities all over the world have not had to do, right? We've had a particularly difficult time dealing with challenges other groups just haven't had to face. So one, climate change makes it very difficult to contest hardships imposed by settler colonial societies. For example, the treaty rights issue, the rigid treaty boundaries, those are things that settler states threw at us. Climate change makes it harder to contest those things. Makes it harder to pursue our ways of life, our cultures, our subsistence, our peaceful relationships with others. I look at a lot of climate change issues where climate change actually pushes some tribes to have to negotiate more with states and municipalities. States and municipalities generally hate tribes. And so it affects our ability to maintain peaceful relationships. And it also just stresses the processes we have internally to make tough decisions. A lot of us, and probably I'll talk about this a little bit later, we've got these Indian Reorganization Act governments that have a wacky and bizarre history tied to facilitating the development of fossil fuel industries. And while a lot of us have adapted these things to actually be pretty good at the end of the day, they're not like our own governance systems, and they're very complicated, and they're in the pockets of a lot of different industries and other interests, and they're democratically elected. And climate change oftentimes really stresses out these decision-making processes. And so for me, when I think about climate change, it's overall an issue of collective continuance or indigenous governance. It affects our aptitude for making adjustments to current and predicted change in ways that are tied to those three different areas that I was talking about. And in other areas of my work, I try to look in more detail, and I'm not going to talk too much about this now, but you can email me if you want more information. We can talk about it later. But I try to actually look specifically at why certain forms of climate change, certain kinds of climate change impacts actually do undermine specific types of relationships that are required for us to have this kind of collective continuance. So I've looked a lot at how certain kinds of climate change impacts promote distrust, where trust is a very important property for being able to survive as a community. So in cases where, like I was saying before, a tribe now has to deal with a county or a municipality, well, those are distrustful relationships, so it pushes us into a situation where we have to work with people we don't trust. Or say the need to work with climate scientists. If you don't trust climate scientists, then it means that your survival is based on working with people you don't trust. But also it affects things like redundancy. Redundancy is this property of relationships, and language is a good example. If there's only one elder in your tribe that speaks the language fluently, it's going to be very hard for other people to learn, right? So redundancy is when you have, like we had historically, a whole bunch of people that spoke fluently, little kids, elders. So if one of the elders died, you had a whole community that would then make sure that the language moved on. Climate change affects redundancy when you can no longer do certain activities that may have been the only way in which you lived or interacted with your grandparents. And if one of those grandparents goes away or whatever it is, then you lose, that whole social network. And so I've looked in more detail at particular ways in which relationships persist and emerge and are made healthy by being trustworthy and redundant, and how climate change presents a very rapid threat to those building blocks of relationships. And that these relationships are intrinsically valuable, such as cultural identity and community identity, but also instrumentally valuable as economic resources. And they're all part of our resilience or our capacity to adapt. And if any of you guys tell anybody that I showed you this, I'm going to kill you, because it's just a draft. But I've tried to actually map out what I think goes into collective continuance. And the tough thing about working with models like this is trying to talk about something that's cyclical, but it also does have kind of a linear component to it that you're thinking about the future. And so I've tried to work this out for myself. And like I said, if you tell anybody I showed you that, or oh, it's being filmed, just like blank that out in the film, you know. I'm being serious.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of this question of justice, so all these things I'm talking about are not pleasant, and certainly there's a whole discussion in the climate change world about opportunities. So there are some tribes that see climate change as an opportunity, and that's another presentation, another discussion. But in this issue of justice, if you read a lot of the popular literature, you see all of this stuff coming out about the problems that tribes are facing, United Nations documents, journalistic documents, and so on. And really the picture that they paint is that indigenous people contributed very little to what we know as anthropogenic climate change. So anthropogenic climate change is kind of the spike that we've seen more recently that we know is traced to industrial activities and deforestation and other things that were part of kind of the industrial colonial complex. And so the idea is that because indigenous people contributed very little to these issues, that other countries owe indigenous people, relief and other services so that we can shoulder these kinds of problems like I've been describing before. And I crossed this out because I don't have time to talk about this stuff today, so I didn't want to confuse you. But the main argument that you see out there is this idea that because societies like the United States, industrial societies, colonial societies, settler societies, because they supported and benefited from industrialization and deforestation, that then they owe the victims of those activities, right? Because even after everything mixed in the atmosphere and so on, right, it's ultimately what is helping to motivate at least some of the problems that I'm telling you about, that they owe actually certain kinds of relief and services and so on to support indigenous people as our communities shoulder these types of impacts. And whenever I see this argument, which is, like I said, very well represented in the different literatures, it just kept striking me that it wouldn't work. It didn't make any sense. So, for example, a lot of the idea of funding and support is to support a tribal adaptation plan or to support science that helps tribes, better understand climate change or to pay for certain things that are needed. But if you just look at a few basic examples, and I have a battery of criticisms that I've written about in other papers, but just to give you an example, if you're just looking at something like treaty areas and reservation areas, right? And so say you've got the 1836 area, which I work in quite a bit, which is a fishery and also applies to inland harvesting. If part of this dotted area is the fishery, and you've got a fish allocation in here, and because of warming and other changes to the water, those fish populations move outside of the treaty boundary, it doesn't matter how well you understand that phenomena. You can't fish those fish anymore if they're no longer in the area that you have a legal right to fish in. And so you can study it, you can hire people to plan about it, and so on. But at the end of the day, the treaty system makes it so that all of that stuff will not be useful. And so I thought, is it really the case that what the United States owes to indigenous people, and the U.S. owes many things to indigenous people, but is it really relief and kind of mitigation of these problems? And even in that quote about wild rice, right, that the treaty is not about just this commodity, rice, that if it becomes harder to obtain because of various forms of environmental change, not only climate change, that the U.S. would just supply that, and then we'd all be good, right? Or supplied something that provided the exact, combination of nutrition as science tells us is in wild rice. That's not what many tribes agreed to. That's not what is important to many tribes. So I just thought that some of these conceptions of climate justice, where climate justice would require relief for the problems I was describing before just couldn't be the whole story. So I was thinking, is there another model of climate justice that would better actually support the situations we faced? And so when I was thinking about this, I had a couple of insights. So the first one is I thought about just Anishinaabe people in general, so Odawa, Potawatomi, Ojibwe people, and I thought about a lot of the stuff that Ojibways especially had been part of in terms of publishing things about their lifestyle. And the first thing I kind of realized that for Native people, the idea of climate change and adapting to change and just this broader idea of environmental change wasn't a new topic. It's the white people and the others that treat climate change as something that now society is just having to grapple with. And every once in a while you'll get a scientist who will be like, well actually the discussion of climate change started in the 19th century with this one scientist, or it started in the 70s. But I realized for us it started a long time ago, as we were always thinking about changes. We didn't talk about them or discuss them or understand them as a climate scientist might. So I'm not saying that we scooped the scientists, but this whole idea that societies have to adapt and change, and that we can do things to the environment which can have a larger impact than we might think that it has when we do things as individuals, is an idea we've had for a long time. If you look at different models of how tribes think things, if you think about things, you've ever seen these Lakota winter accounts that Lakota people kept very careful records of things that happened during the year, and they used this to plan. And so I realized, first of all, just for us, climate change and environmental change more broadly is not really that new of a concept. And then what I also realized is that anthropogenic climate change, or actually, to put it more precisely, anthropogenic environmental change, or the idea that human people could do something to the environment that would create the kind of problems I was describing before, that is not new for Native people. In fact, a lot of the problems I was describing at the beginning of the presentation, they're actually very similar in impact and in type to ones that we've been going through since colonization. So 3 examples. In Michigan, landscape change, deforestation. One of the things that's happened in Michigan through climate change is loss of our black ash basket making tradition, which depends on ash trees. So not related to climate change, this invasive species, the emerald ash borer, began eating up the trees. Climate change makes the habitat for emerald ash borer a lot better. But then one of the reasons why we're not that resilient with respect to ash trees is because when Michigan was deforested and the swamps were dried and things like that, that already depleted, what was a huge resource, a huge place for being able to have access to ash. So it's not actually correct to say that we were like basket making, and selling them to white people, and all of a sudden you get this big change, and then they go away, right? It was built on a longer history of anthropogenic environmental change, and that climate change, as it's understood today, is just a recent part of that narrative. An obvious one is pollution. I know for many of you here, this hits close to home because of all the industrial activities in the St. Lawrence Seaway and other ones that especially Haudenosaunee and other tribes in this region have faced. But pollution has a similar effect to what I'm talking about, right? Shifts where you can go fishing. It changes the dynamics of fish populations. It changes what foods you can have access to. And another of my work where we talk about climate change and gender as well, right? Where depending on what a tribe's gender system is and where one fits within that system, you can experience things more harshly than others. It was the same with pollution, right? Where I think a lot of Haudenosaunee women, felt that they were being harmed more than other members of the community. So we've seen that before. And then the obvious one, relocation. In Alaska and Kivalina, they're relocating. We relocated too, and are going through, in a weird way, some of the same types of hurdles that they went through. We had a military escort there working with the Army Corps of Engineers. It was a bureaucratic nightmare for us. It's a bureaucratic nightmare for them. They're all, I think, about 300 people, but we weren't that big either. We were probably 1,000, or I think it was 800 people went to Oklahoma. So, you see all these things, you realize this is a story that we've been through before. And so, to bring this back then to how is it that the United States or other settler states could understand their responsibility for Indigenous climate change adaptation in relation to this, what we actually have to realize is that the reason why all of the things that I described happened was because the settler colonial strategy was not just about resource exploitation, was not just about a number of other things that we know happened, but it was specifically a process that the US intentionally and deliberately undertook to limit our capacity to adapt. And so I want to talk a little bit about this, and I want to say that this is a significant idea, because one of the problems with the old form of climate justice that I was talking about, that's tied to the fact that burning of fossil fuels and so on, that led to these impacts, is that a lot of the impacts we experience today are based on fossil fuel burning that like people's like great-great-great-grandparents did. And so they'll be like, well, those people didn't know they were doing, and certainly the current generation isn't responsible for things that our great-great-great-great-grandparents did. And so people don't want to take responsibility for that. But I think if we look at this history, you'll actually see that stuff that the United States did deliberately to us to limit our capacity to adapt, the same policies are the ones that the US still supports today. So there's actually no break in culpability, if you want to use that kind of term. There's no break in causal responsibility. And so if you just look at a broad history, and this is a narrative that's well known to most folks in Native studies and folks that have worked with tribes, you can see that every single policy was created to limit our adaptation. So you look at the treaty era, and treaty era, right, they demarcated these boundaries that I was showing you. And one of the weird things about this, and we see this in the literature, is that if you look at the minutes of the treaty where we engaged in oral dialogue and so on, which for Native people that was more important to us, right? So if you look in those minutes, a lot of times Native people thought that the treaties were going to be subject to renewal and change and so on, that they weren't these solidified documents. The US only cared about those documents that we've read, the ones that say like, west of the river and so on. And the US said that they were treaties based on rights and that those borders wouldn't change, they were firm, right, and so on. And so if you look at some of the climate change vulnerabilities that I was talking about, what makes Native people particularly vulnerable to those problems are the fact that the US interprets these treaties as so rigid, and we're in this situation where we can't actually kind of snap out of that situation. Another problem, right, is that after the treaty period, they had this great policy of just liquidating all the reservation lands into private property. And that's created all sorts of limits. This is my reservation, and I bet you think, oh, the gray area, that's the Potawatomis, and the white and the black people live in the purple and the orange areas. Well, actually, it's just the opposite, right? Our land that we have sovereignty over, or that we own in fee and pay taxes on like everybody else, is the orange and the purple. And the rest is dominated by other groups. So the liquidation of Indian land created a situation where it's very hard for us to adapt, even when in our own reservation, because it's not really ours. And then, as many of you know, the story of what happened to the private property allotments is there was no probate system set up, so they just got divided equally among the heirs. So if any of you, still have allotments, they're oftentimes like 2 feet by 2 feet. And so there too, right, these are limitations on a society's capacity to adapt. They fragment, they fracture, they divide and limit people's land. And then finally, when the US realized that this was kind of a messed up policy, especially if you're trying to get people to sign leases for extractive industries, they brought back the tribal governments, but you had to have a corporate charter. And those tribal governments are ones that were actually designed to facilitate what we now know are the drivers of climate change. The fossil fuel industries. And so, right, you get the situation where the Navajo Nation is really torn because a lot of the members don't like the fact that they're, dependent on burning coal, but then this tribal government has been structured to serve business interests, so that even though the people who might be in the council and so on may in their own views be against this situation, it's like they have to do it because of the short-term jobs and other problems. And so it strapped us with a system that's very different from the seasonal system that we used to live in, and is one where we're constantly subject to participating within this fossil fuel economy, right? It denies our capacity to adapt in ways that are comfortable for our communities based on our experiences, our cultures, and our way of life. It also served to then fragment. I tried to draw as best as I could, but I'm leaving out a few people. This system, the IRA governments then divided us tremendously just among Anishinaabe people, right? I mean, all these splotches are separate governments that Canada or the US sees as a separate entity, when many of these historically overlapped. They talk to each other, they make decisions. This is us down here. You know, pretty crazy, right? Very hard to, you know, adapt as a larger whole when you're divided up. And then the termination period for tribes that retained even some control over their reservation area, like the Menominee, during the time that they were terminated, you know, a 20-year period, this area, which is in the part of their reservation, got divided up to be like vacation cottages, right? And they carved up this area to make more shoreline and so on. And when they were reaffirmed as sovereign in the 70s, this was all like white property owners who have these little property organizations that make it so Native people can't, you know, buy land back. And so they even lost land as well. And then now we're kind of in this era where tribes are expected to model their governmental activities around states. And these are a lot of the entities that I work with in my own work. So this is the Native Self-Determination Educational Assistance Act. But what this has done is it's compartmentalized our government, and since tribes are blocked from going into a lot of businesses and raising tax revenue, almost all these agencies are grant dependent. So when I try to work with people on climate change, it's very hard to allocate the staff time to be able to deal with climate change, because you literally have to raise enough money to hire somebody new. And if you know anything about federal grants for environmental stuff, there's just not enough, right? Money to do that. It's very hard to figure out how to get appropriate staffing time. And because of the siloing of the different agencies, and a lot of these folks don't even talk to each other. The Oneidas actually talk to each other very well, but the other tribes don't post their organizational charts online. But like the language department sometimes never talks to the natural resources department, which to me is absolutely absurd. But who has the time to make those connections? Who has the time to liaison? And then right when tribes were actually gaining power, right, you get this policy of implicit divestiture, which it looked like we started losing court cases where our regulatory agencies were trying to enjoin or stop a non-native person doing something on our reservation. And so you can see that the settler colonial strategy was actually maybe even fundamentally based on doing these things: containing, relocating, fragmenting, fractionating, checkerboarding, and erasing. And all of these things we know now from a lot of science, such as coupled human natural systems science, are really bad ways of adapting to environmental change. And so we went from a system that was very adaptive to one which was actually designed to facilitate the adaptation of other groups. And all of the policies I just described are ones that the US still goes along with, I guess except for allotment. And but even recently I've heard within some of the inner discussions in Congress and in Interior that there are people that will still advocate for termination of different kinds. It's a lot more sneaky, and it's not called termination. That's still an ongoing concern. Transfer of land into private property is still a concern. So what we realize is that the US actually has made us vulnerable to these climate change impacts because of all these policies. It's not the impacts themselves that cause the harms and that threaten our collective continuance. It's all of these actual underlying policies, and even though some of them are from 100 years ago, they're the same ones that the US supports today. So my idea was that actually the responsibility that the United States has is not only relief for damages or for losses, but it's what I call the pending responsibility. That's okay, I'm like done in a second.
Okay.
Me and your battery were like on the same level. Yeah. And so what climate change is, or anthropogenic climate change today, is it's just another reminder that should bring attention to the fact that the US has actually never had responsibility or been responsible for dealing with problems that inflicted at the time on us anthropogenic environmental change, and that fostered the development of the fossil fuel industry and other drivers of climate change, such as landscape change and deforestation for agriculture. And that because the US has never done this, it's not a new responsibility, which is what people talk about today, right? The US has new responsibilities to support tribal adaptation to climate change impacts. It's actually just a time to not only remind, but remind and enforce that the US has all of these old responsibilities that are precisely the ones that make us vulnerable in the first place. And one of the best examples of this is the village of Kivalina, because one of the reasons why relocation is so hard for them it's not because they couldn't have handled it a long time ago. They used to be like nomadic. They used to move around all the time, but the U.S. forced them to settle on that little island because they wanted to put a school there. And in the 50s, they permanently settled there, and so they became, like many of us, permanent settlement people who are, who have a very hard time moving to another permanent settlement. And so there again, you see that that example. So I look forward to chatting with you guys more about these ideas, but if you were wondering about Indigenous climate justice issues, now you know.
Thank you so much. Have some time for some questions, comments.
I'm wondering how, I know you touched on this at the beginning explicitly in terms of the global situation, right? How all of this is, some of this is being addressed through the UN. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how these specific sites connect in that way, connect globally with other Indigenous situations where the same thing has been happening.
Yeah. So one of the things, to make a long story short, is so in the U.S. in the U.S. sphere, there's been a very large division between tribal leaders who work within the federally recognized governments, or even people in state and unrecognized governments that are trying to, get federal recognition. And so you've got a whole system of tribal leadership there. So that's one thing. And then they've been totally disconnected from the group of Indigenous people, primarily working with NGOs that have made a ton of progress in the UN. So Indigenous people have made more progress in the UN than any other non-state group. But literally the people that, and there are exceptions to this, but the people that go to the UN do not communicate with tribal leadership and back and forth. And in fact, in a lot of times there's tension there. And what you've gotten is that both groups have focused on different issues. So for example, the activists at the UN, when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came online, it was primarily about mitigation. Because back in the day, if you even said adaptation, you were considered to be morally corrupt because that suggested that we'd given up. But then once we know that there's backloaded climate change and that we're going to get a rise of 2 degrees Celsius anyways, even if we did the impossible and cut all our emissions, that adaptation has now become something you can discuss without being criticized. And even today, geoengineering is something you can discuss. But so the activists focused a lot on mitigation, and they often had views that were far more radical than the UN, right? They wanted deeper emissions cuts and so on. And so they were very much focused on that and on the tactics that NGOs and activists would engage in. The tribal leaders, thinking almost in more of a kind of a governing sense, right, were always focused on adaptation. Because they were thinking, okay, if the fishery changes or if inland harvesting changes, what do I do to avoid getting voted out of office, right? Or should I even ignore climate change? Or should I pay attention to it? And so they were always more focused on adaptation. And so there was already tension between those groups. And then there was more tension with respect to climate change because they were even working in different areas. And like I said, there's a longer story to this. But because of that actual disconnection, like a lot of tribal leaders I work with, they don't invest that much in what happens in the Indigenous caucus in the UNFCCC. They should. And it's also the case that some of the opportunities that activists have worked very hard to create at the UN level, they don't have the time or the communications to make those benefits ones that, and those resources ones that tribes here could take advantage of. But this connection here is just a US-centric one, right? Other Indigenous groups have many more complicated connections between those who show up at the UN and those who are in leadership positions more locally. And even what I'm saying, I think there's probably a lot of people that would disagree with some of my interpretations, so I wouldn't, say that I'm pretty authoritative on this. But I would say that one of the key projects that I'm really trying to be part of, that's why I've begun to go to the UN and stop being such a local yokel, is that there is a lot of stuff you can do at the UN level. And if it is possible to patch up some of those relationships and have a more unified front, I think we could do a lot more work. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One example is in a lot of the policy documents I've worked on that we've had approved by federal agencies and so on. If you look at the documents, we quote and cite the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. UNDRIP is a great resource because it connects human rights to environment. And that's not something that you have a lot in the federal system. And because Obama has agreed to acknowledge the declaration as aspirational, it's not bad for us to use it. Nobody's going to follow it, but you're actually seeing it in federal policy, which is a big deal because the U.S. doesn't even have a Human Rights Council. The other thing you're seeing is that as the UN has shifted to adaptation, it's creating an opportunity for really good conversation because a lot of the people in the activist world hadn't looked at adaptation, right? Because they were really pursuing mitigation. But we've been doing a ton of adaptation stuff here. And so we can then talk to each other and talk about what we've done with adaptation, but then they can help those of us that have worked more than tribal leadership understand mitigation and understand how we can help the different protests and other activities that they do globally. And so at the last, the climate march in New York City, there were a ton of people there actually from tribal leadership that typically don't show up to that stuff. And so really, there's other examples too, but I think it's an exciting time to bring those scales together because whereas the activists were really working at the scale of international governance, the tribal leadership was working at the scale of governance where you can actually promulgate policies that bind people like law, you know, and that would be very powerful to put those together. I usually don't answer questions by talking that much, but that was a big question.
I have two questions. One is, I mean, if you could talk about what Obama has done in terms of help, because when he was elected, I remember, you know, that, I mean, not many presidents talk about Native American issues, and I know Clinton seemed concerned about Native Americans, but Obama, I would like to know what Obama's doing. And then I know this is very different, you don't have to answer it or talk about it. But being, well, because you're working with the UN, I was thinking, I've always been concerned about Leonard Peltier, and since Obama's leaving, doesn't the president like give amnesty to certain people that are in prison at the end of their term? There's a name for that.
Well, I don't even know anything about that.
About Leonard Peltier.
No, I know about Leonard Peltier,
Right.
but I don't
But
know
they
anything about
give,
the
the
policy.
president gives amnesty towards the end of their, you know,
Yeah.
presidency, and I was wondering, you know, what's
Someone here
happening
probably
with
knows
that,
about
because
that.
I would love to see the man released.
Yeah. Yeah, someone here probably knows about it. I don't know I'll answer your first part of the
Okay.
question. You're the one that asked me what the name of the glacier was too, right? Yeah, you always ask me stuff I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. But in terms of the first question about what Obama's done, like in general for Native people, in particular on climate change. So because Obama's been heavily associated with climate change and has not failed to discuss it, for me, I've had more of a positive experience with Obama, but that does not mean anything for all the other Native programs. But it's also the case that whatever Obama has done is not enough. And I think some of the people I was talking to last night, I was telling this example, but like when Obama came into office, and this was when I was first starting to work in this area, I was studying, you know, federal budgets with a couple of other people to try to look for disparities. And within Interior, Department of Interior, when they rolled out the climate change program for all of Interior, they divided it up into separate programs for the different Interior agencies. Everybody got a piece of money. So like, you know, the climate science centers and geological survey were funded at like 60 million, and the landscape conservation cooperatives and fish and wildlife were funded like 50 million, and the BIA actually just got 0. There's a 0 in BIA. And then even in those other groups, they're supposed to do some work with tribes, but their initial spending on tribal issues, all of which were through competitive grants, were not very good. We're talking like in the low hundreds of thousands. So initially there was actually no funding for adaptation, but we kind of used as a wedge Obama's interest and commitment to climate change and got the BIA budgets up to, like, you know, this year it's been 12 or 13 million. But still, that's like terrible, because that's 566 or 67 federally recognized tribes that are going to compete over 13 million. And then like some of that is just for coastal stuff, so that, you know, doesn't include all tribes anyways. And so if you just look at like BIA, for example, they have a very small amount of money for supporting climate change adaptation. And if you look at the other agencies as well, like NOAA and so on, they do have these climate change programs. Like NOAA has the RISA centers, which are the Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Centers. They're supposed to work with tribes, but in each regional science and assessment center, they might only have like 1 or 2 very small tribal projects. And actually in the Great Lakes, for all of these different science groups, I think I'm the major like coordinator of all of the tribal projects. And if you look in other regions too, it's you have one person that's like very motivated to coordinate this stuff, and that's why they're doing things. So I wouldn't say that Obama has been terribly great on tribal issues, but with Obama there has been funding there for adaptation, which the Republicans would definitely not have supported. So it has been somewhat positive for me, but again, going back to the point of my presentation, it's all this kind of relief stuff that doesn't actually matter, because most tribes are not really facing a lack of funding or appreciation for science or the need to understand certain things better. They're facing these underlying political concerns, you know, similar to what happened to a lot of African Americans in Hurricane Katrina. You know, it wasn't an accident that they were harmed more, you know, from that. So if you look at policy questions, you know, was the U.S.'s main response just to provide them with a whole bunch of relief? Well, yes, but also there's this issue of like discrimination and ghettoization and things like that, which underlies their situation. Yeah, good question. Yeah, go ahead.
So, thank you. I always love your presentations. You mentioned some conflict within the Navajo Nation about what to do regarding coal. How do you see, can you talk a little bit about conflicts between tribes when it comes to things like extraction, like, for example, the conflict between Lummi and Crow nations, where the Crow people want to continue their coal extraction and export it out through the ports in Lummi territory. One example of many. How do tribes work through these conflicts when it's sort of like,
yeah, but this is a good point, because this has been something that's upset me quite a bit, because the overall tribal approach to climate justice coming out of the United States colonial sphere is among kind of the least radical, I think, internationally, in terms of when we try to translate things into U.S. policy. So for example, I always try to run stuff through the National Congress of American Indians, as well as other national groups. But the problem is when you send some language for them to approve, you've got the Crow, the Navajo, right, and they tell you to take out all of the stuff on mitigation, or that they won't agree to it. And so anytime you try to do stuff with respect to climate justice, you always have to, if you want a big sign-on, right, then you have to satisfy these groups. It's been very frustrating to me, because I know a lot of like Navajo and Crow people, and they're not happy with what their government's doing. I know even some people in those governments, and they personally don't like it, but they feel that they have to, you know, they feel they can't act quickly to make change. And that's going to slow us down substantially. There's even, I'm trying to think of some examples off the top of my head. You know, the one that you mentioned with the Crow and the Lummi, that's been one of the most significant ones having to do with climate change, but it's also expanded quite a bit. So you know, it's a number of Pacific Northwest tribes that try to block shipments and things like that. And so all the coal producing and energy intensive tribes are engaged in a lot of inside baseball to fight against each other. And that's actually been fairly frustrating. Another area of conflict you see actually more locally is when you're talking about something like the treaty allocations. So in Michigan, in the 1836 treaty area, it has something kind of weird that's similar, or it's not similar to other treaty areas, which is the fishery, the part of the treaty that includes the fishery. And I'm using treaty just because you guys don't know the background, but that we call them consent decrees in Michigan, because Michigan actually freaked out when it saw that the other states lost their court cases against tribes on the fishery, so like, we don't want to go there, we'll settle. And so they created these consent decrees, an inland one and a Great Lakes one. The inland one won't be renegotiated, but the Great Lakes one will in 2020. And there's 5 tribes that are party to that. And one tribe in particular is about 70%, or actually higher, about 80% of the commercial fishery. And all the other 4 tribes have really small fishing operations. And if you look at then how those tribes think, right, the smaller tribes, their natural resource operations on the lake are primarily about restoration of native species, whereas the big fishing tribe is doing all these commercial activities and so on. And they're a lot more callous about climate change and just want to look at it in terms of the commercial fishery. But a lot of what they want conflicts with some of these activities that the other tribes are doing. And the interesting thing about that is that the activities the other tribes are doing are not small in scale. And here's what I mean. So they might not have a big commercial fishery, but like one of the tribes has a sturgeon restoration program that I've written a lot about. The sturgeon restoration program was so successful, and they have a ceremony each year that gets about 700 or 800 people. It's, well, not, that's exaggerated, it's more like 500 or 600 from anybody, right? And that program is so successful that not only has it helped improve tribal, non-tribal relations in the area, but other states have copied it. And you know, like White Earth and Rainy River have a really good sturgeon restoration. It's also had that kind of impact. And so you can see, right, that there's a trade-off there. And when you've got the lawyers doing the negotiations in the, you guys both lawyers, no offense to lawyers. All right. But we've got the lawyers, right, trying to interpret what they think are effective trade-offs to make and so on, and oftentimes means that you end up like we did in Michigan with the last allocation agreement, consent decree, where tribes gave up far more than, you know, and tribes were pitted against each other. And so yeah, so that's a big thorn in my side, and actually I know what white people need to do, but I don't know what what tribes need to do sometimes. Yeah.
I saw that you had a paper on Indigenous women. Could you kind of speak about how, what you see the issues are with climate change affecting Indigenous women?
Yep. So a couple of things I think are important, and I've got, if you or anyone is interested in the topic, I actually just finished, it's like, I don't know, it's like over 100 pages, but it's a comprehensive lit review of everything that's been done so far on Indigenous people, gender, and climate change, because it's one of those academic areas where if you, like many of you here, if you visit a lot of communities and you're thinking about your own community and climate change, you know that gender is huge, right? But if you look at what's been done academically or by tribal governments or by the US or whoever it is, there's like almost nothing there. And so we've got that review, but then the article I think that was on here. So one of the things that drives me nuts, and maybe it's just because I'm Anishinaabe, but if you look at like a lot of cultural revitalization efforts, political efforts, anything you see, right, the face of it is always these men. But oftentimes the people doing the effort, people with the creativity, the people that are really actually trying to restore traditional roles and responsibilities and so on are women. And one of the first things I was trying to do is actually bring out the leadership of women and how there's oftentimes weird issues that we face. So for example, in one tribe, So Pacific Northwest, the Umatilla tribe, they had a natural resource department. Like almost all tribal natural resource departments, it's almost all men. Until recently, it was probably all white. But even when it became less white, it was all men. And because of that, they weren't doing any work on the harvesting that women were doing. And women had no leadership. And so when they went to do a climate change, there's all these guys making decisions about, what to do. And so they did a comprehensive reform to try to completely change that. And as they changed that, their climate adaptation planning completely improved because they were actually doing something that had equity in it. And so I've looked at a lot of issues like that. I've also just looked at Indigenous women and vulnerability. It's no surprise that if you look at a number of different kinds of climate change impacts, that women are going to be harmed more within Indigenous communities. And so one of the important parts of Indigenous women's leadership is that if you have more recognized leadership by Indigenous women, then some of those harms will be things that won't be brushed under the carpet. And so in that article, I talked a lot about important cases where Indigenous women were taking leadership on climate change. And another key thing I'll just mention, among many things I would like to talk about, but that one of the problems too that we face with a lot of tribes is that the federally recognized tribal government, is oftentimes very male dominated, but the leadership efforts of women oftentimes fall outside of the federally recognized agencies. It's like in the Great Lakes, you have the Mother Earth Water Walk, run by elder women, and so a very powerful event, and has changed a lot of people's lives. But it's not considered to have any, it's not considered to be within the realm of sovereignty and self-determination, right? The First Nations band councils are, and the federally recognized tribal governments are. So I've also tried to point out this problem as well, that things that women tend to do are excluded or ignored or erased from what's considered to count as the face of tribal sovereignty, which I think is highly, highly problematic.
Well, I'd like to invite everyone to join us for a bit of lunch. And can you help me thank Kyle for such a rich discussion?